Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing U.S. policy in Syria, the new U.S. strategy in Iran, and the upcoming North Korea summit. To talk about all of this, we are joined by J.D. Gordon, former Pentagon spokesman and Trump campaign's advisor. And we have with us also David Tafuri, international lawyer and former Obama campaign advisor. Thank you so much both for joining us today. Let's start by talking about the Turkish-American relationships. We know now that there is some potential for a reconciliation there. There is a deal that's being worked on in Manbij. Do you think this is going to go through, and what are the obstacles that are going to be facing this initiative by the United States and Turkey?
I hope so. Thank you for having us on the show today. I hope so, because Turkey is too important an ally to have things not go well. It's a NATO member. It has one of the largest militaries in that part of the world. And so the stakes are too high to not get along with Turkey. So I'm pretty optimistic that things will go forward. President Erdogan, of course, has been a challenge for the U.S. and for NATO and for his neighbors as well. Though I am optimistic in the long term, we will have better relations with Turkey moving forward.
Some people in Syria were hoping, especially in the northern part of Syria, that this type of scenario of collaboration between Turkey and the United States would actually emerge in other parts because of the alternative that they have, which is the Assad regime in Iran. So, I mean, is there potential for things to be, because we like it or not, we have the longest borders between Syria and Turkey. The Turkish borders and the Syrian borders, those are the longest borders for both countries.
That's right.
So what is the solution for that northern part of Syria, which has the Idlib, another chaotic place where Turkey has some influence there? What could we see in terms of further collaboration between the United States?
Well, there are a lot of different options. Most of them are not very good, unfortunately. When I was referring to Turkish sovereignty, I meant within Turkey's own borders. However, to have Kurds on the Turkish border that the Kurds see as a threat is a threat to their sovereignty if they think that terrorist attacks are being waged into Turkey from Syria. So it's a delicate balance. The issue is, too, that we haven't mentioned yet, but there are millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey. And if Turkey wants to punish the United States and our allies in Europe, they can just let as many people go as they want into Europe, which is destabilizing Europe. Europe's already being destabilized by a number of refugees from not just Syria, but from all around the region, even from Pakistan and Afghanistan, who come through Turkey, often through the land route. So Turkey could really punish the United States and our allies if they want to. So that's why the Americans, we have to be careful about how much we support the Turks and how much we support the Kurds, even though I do think probably autonomous regions for the Kurds, like in Iraq, are probably the way to go for Syria.
There's the other aspect that the administration is working on very heavily right now, which is Iran. And we know about the sanctions that are getting placed against Iran one by one, back to back. Now we heard that Khamenei is actually escalating in his tone and also saying that they're going to be enriching uranium more, even though the European Union, still the countries from Europe, didn't pull out of the deal. The deal is still in place. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think that it's still not entirely clear what this administration's position is on Iran. Secretary of State Pompeo gave his first policy speech. It was on Iran. He made a number of demands from Iran, which he wants Iran to accede to in order for a new nuclear deal to be put in place. All of the demands are appropriate for the U.S. to expect Iran to do, but they're not going to happen simply because the U.S. has asked for it. And by pulling out of the nuclear deal, we've actually pulled ourselves out of a situation where we have influence with Iran. Now it's the European countries who've maintained their presence in that deal, who stayed in the deal, who will have more influence in Iran. So that's one of the things that concerns me. Another thing that concerns me is that while Secretary of State Pompeo made very clear and decisive statements about what he wants Iran to do, he made no explanation of how he expects to get Iran to do it, other than putting in place sanctions. But we know that the sanctions worked best when we had cooperation from all of our allies around the world. And we're not going to get that because the European countries right now are saying they're staying in the deal, which means they're not going to reinstitute sanctions on Iran. So I'd like to hear more about what this administration's policy is about how it's going to achieve these things with Iran.
What do you think, JD?
Well, I think President Trump has the right approach to pressure Iran because if we don't pressure Iran, they'll continue to enrich themselves with the sanctions relief that they had been getting to fund terrorism globally. And also, Iran will get a nuclear weapon under that accord because the accord has a shelf life. It isn't in perpetuity. It expires. And at the end of that, they can get a nuclear weapon. Iran has been threatening the entire region since the 1979 revolution. They want to export revolutionary Islam, and it's a Shia form of Islam. They want to be the kingpin of the Middle East. And in their way, of course, is Saudi Arabia and our other allies. They want to wipe Israel off the map. I mean, they openly talk about genocide. Hitler talked about genocide too. He did it.
Yes.
So when Iran says things like that, you have to take them at their word. And we value Israel in the United States. We value Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in the United States. We ought to back our allies there and pressure Iran to the maximum extent possible so they don't get a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. I mean, even when you talk about what's happening in terms of the European countries, you know, a lot of the experts who I've spoken with recently were saying that the European companies are actually forced to leave Iran because they're not going to be choosing Iran over the American market. When there's going to be sanctions, like the administration is right now going to implement sanctions against any company that is actually working within Iran, that means all of these companies are going to pull out because simply there's just no comparison there.
Well, it's complicated. Some multilateral companies may fit into your description, which is that they're impacted by the U.S. sanctions, so they will pull out. But smaller and medium-sized European companies that don't have any business interests in the U.S. will likely stay and likely continue to profit from their dealing with Iran. But also, it's also important to note that Europe put in place before banking sanctions on Iran. And those were in coordination with the U.S. banking sanctions. That really strangled Iran. Those banking sanctions from the European countries are not going to go back into place. So there's so many more loopholes now for Iran to continue to do business and continue to get money and the revenues that it needs. So I'm just saying that there's no way the U.S. on its own can use sanctions as the hammer that it wants to be to get these things from Iran. Now, we had an Iran deal in place. It was not perfect. It had problems. But one thing that was nice about the nuclear deal is Iran was complying with it. And everyone agrees with that. So Iran did give up its nuclear weapons program. Now, if it stays in this deal with Europe, then ostensibly it's not going to start the nuclear program again, and that's really good. But the U.S., again, this administration has failed to explain what is its policy other than Iran, other than having this wish list, which is nice, but there's no strategy for accomplishing
it. But David, I mean, Khamenei yesterday said that he's going to be enriching uranium as he is staying in the deal, supposedly, with the European countries. So they're not really, I mean, sticking to the deal as of now. Based on Khamenei's decision when he tweeted actually on that yesterday. The other thing is that when you're saying that, you know, let's keep the deal, Iran was complying with it, but we saw what Iran has been doing in the region while they, you know, maintain this deal, while there's all these sites that nobody can inspect because the deal actually had a lot of loopholes within it too. I mean, what is the solution that you're suggesting?
Well, if Iran does start producing nuclear material again, that would be a violation of the JCPOA, and then it would dissolve. They would be in violation of it. Europe would have to pull out of it as well, and there would be sanctions be put back in place. That could then put us back into a situation where we actually do have leverage over Iran. But with respect to the other part of your question, you asked what is being done about sort of Iran's support for terrorists around the world, like Hezbollah, like Iran's atrocities and human rights violations in Syria, its role in helping Assad kill innocent people in Syria. But nothing that President Trump has done has actually impacted that. In fact, the things that President Trump has done is making it easier for Iran to act in Syria. We're pulling back. We just talked about how we're pulling out of the north. We're pulling out of Manbij. We're pulling out, we pulled a lot of our support and our program in southern Syria out, and Iran has moved into that vacuum. So this is what's so contradictory about President Trump's strategy on Iran. He says he wants to take a hard stance against Iran. He pulled out of the nuclear deal, which Iran was complying with, and yet he does nothing about the things that he says he's concerned about, like Iran's support for Hezbollah and Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq. So it makes no sense.
What do you answer to that, JD?
Well, I would disagree.
The contradictions in the policy.
Well, there are some contradictions from the White House.
Big ones.
Across the board. Though I would disagree a little bit with David on the issue with Hezbollah, because my boss on the campaign, then Senator Jeff Sessions, is now the Attorney General. And in January, they announced this anti-Hezbollah task force to take on Hezbollah with relation to their drug empire that they've established in Latin America, which is $1 billion empire right now. DOJ has already rolled up some Hezbollah operatives, and they've busted people for being engaged in this drug trafficking and money laundering. And Hezbollah is Iran's terror proxy. And they operate not just in Lebanon, where they're based, but also throughout Latin America in places like Venezuela
its main
and
proxy.
Paraguay.
I mean, Hezbollah is the main arm of the Iranian regime, yeah.
So the administration is cracking down on Hezbollah in Iran through that task force.
I mean, you know, kind of, I wanted to talk about the options with Tehran if the administration continues at least to be serious, even though to you it's not very serious, and then there's a lot of loopholes within the policy. But if the administration keeps pressuring Iran, because we know that now we're going to have new sanctions getting snapped against the Iranian regime in August, then in November, that's going to include the World Bank. I mean, this is really major sanctions. While we have the unrest within Iran, the protests continue, small, but they come, you know, in different places, wave by wave. So things are not, you know, getting any easier for the Iranian regime. However, there is that, you know, the threat to Israel, Iran is doing in Syria. What are the options for this administration to handle Iran and to actually basically cut off its arms, as they always talk about the octopus, you know, the octopus arms? Is there any options that you would suggest to the administration to do?
Yes.
What would you suggest?
I would suggest that President Trump, first of all, do what he said he wanted to do with respect to the nuclear agreement, which was modify it. He's not made clear how he wants it modified. He should put together a modified proposed nuclear agreement, present it to our European allies, present it to Iran, and try to push for Iran to sign that deal. Because as you mentioned, what we can't allow is for Iran to get a nuclear weapons program back on track. That's number one. Number two, the U.S. should really hurt Iran where it can. That includes in Iraq, where there are Shiite militias that are supported by Iran. They're basically Iranian proxies. We've looked the other way. Some of those Shiite Iranian-backed militias now have U.S. weapons. And we haven't done anything to police that. Nothing. And in Syria as well, we should push back against the Iranian forces. Instead of backing away, pulling out of Syria, giving it up to Iran and Russia and Assad, we should actually increase our presence and our support for the moderate groups that are fighting against the Assad regime and fighting against Iran and Russia.
What do you say to that, JD?
Well, President Trump made it clear on the campaign, where I was the director of national security, that he did not want to be engaged in places like Syria if he didn't have to.
Yes.
So he has conducted 2 missile strikes against Syria. They were relatively minor in scope, but they were missile strikes.
Yeah.
Remember, President Obama talked about red lines for chemical weapons, attacks on civilians, and he did nothing, so Obama looked very weak. At least President Trump follows through. Generally, when he makes a threat, he carries it out.
Yes.
For the most part, and he did in Syria twice. So I think that's helpful. But he also doesn't want to be engaged long term. He doesn't want to have U.S. troops there. He announced recently at a rally in the United States, at a political rally, that will be out of Syria very soon. He leaves it to others.
And then he changed his mind a couple of times after that.
He does. That's why I'm so glad that great people like you have a chance to meet President Trump and talk to him, so he knows more about Syria.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we're seeing those changes in the policy, but we did see that the president did stick to the main points. For example, when he talked about pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, you were saying he wants to modify it. He did say he wants to modify it, but he also said that he doesn't think it's a good deal, and if he couldn't modify it, he has to pull out, and he did. The same thing now we're seeing the North Korea come in meeting. That's going to be a very important step for the United States. If it's okay for us to move there, what do you think is going to come out of this? I know that a lot of people are pessimistic. They're saying he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons. But what are the options for North Korea? Also, economically, they're struggling. I mean, they're asking the United States to pay for his visit to Singapore for the summit. That's how bad his situation is economically.
So with respect to North Korea, I think that President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo have made some good progress. By getting this summit set up, it was off and on and off and on. It's on now. I think that's good. I think it's good for President Trump to meet the leader of North Korea. They haven't got any full concessions yet, but there is some suggestion that North Korea is seriously considering denuclearizing. Whether they're actually serious about that, they're actually at least saying the right things, if not doing the right things now. I'm not that optimistic that a lot is going to come out of this summit, but I think it's important that they meet and they get started on a process to get a nuclear deal in place with North Korea. But one of the things that worries me is that I don't see President Trump getting a better nuclear deal with North Korea than we had under the JCPOA with Iran. So I don't really understand how we're going to be able to agree and reach compromise with North Korea, given some of the President Trump's statements with respect to Iran. And I just want to follow up on one other thing that JD said, which is he mentioned the airstrikes against the Assad regime because of the use of chemical weapons. And I think that was very important. And I applauded that when President Trump ordered it both times. I've written about it. But I'd just like to see President Trump do more to show that he's pushing back against authoritarian regimes like the Assad regime.
I mean, when we talk about, and I wanted to point this out to you, David, that when you said that we had, all of what's happening in Syria in terms of the lack of action and allowing Iran to kind of maintain its presence, and you talked about the Iraqi militias. Well, those Iraqi militias were fighting under the Obama administration against ISIS also, right? I mean, that was a policy that was started off by the previous president and not the current president.
Well, President Obama made some serious foreign policy mistakes as well in the region. And I would certainly agree that one of those mistakes was not following up on his red line commitment with respect to Assad's use of chemical weapons when President Obama was the president. And I would also agree that the Obama administration didn't take a tougher stance against the presence of Shia militias in Iraq. But really the growth in strength and influence and power of those Shia militias in Iraq, the Hashd-e-Shabi, really happened under Trump.
Yeah, so you think it's this administration more than the previous
Correct.
one. What is the political solution that now we're going to be hearing about? Or are we going to be hearing about anything? Because we even stopped hearing about Geneva and about any solutions in Syria. I mean, what is the policy today by the administration towards Syria, in your opinion?
Well, President Trump doesn't want to see any more chemical attacks against civilians, so that's a good start. He is pushing back against authoritarians, like David had mentioned, and so that's positive. I think at the end of the day, the U.S. needs to back some type of autonomous regions for the Kurds, for instance, and other groups, because Bashar al-Assad would like to wipe them out if he could. Bashar al-Assad just wants to conquer every other group that's in opposition to him. He calls them all terrorists. The Russians, unfortunately, are supporting him because it's in Russia's interest to support Bashar al-Assad since he's been such a close ally. They have the naval base at Tartus, which is the only base that the Russians have outside of the former Soviet Union. So it's very important symbolically for Russia. Russia wants to be great again. Vladimir Putin wants to make Russia great again. They want to be a global superpower again, and they're not. So Putin's trying, and Syria is a very symbolic win for him to be involved. But I think the U.S. should work with our allies in Europe and allies in the region, like the Saudis, to have some type of autonomous regions where Bashar al-Assad is not slaughtering his own people, or it doesn't have the opportunity to do that.
So like in the south and the northeast?
In the south, in the pockets in the northeast, pockets in the northwest, just like Iraq has an autonomous region for the Kurds, but not just one autonomous region for the Kurds in Syria, multiple autonomous regions for various ethnic sects and groups.
What do you think, David, of this solution?
I fully agree with that suggestion and that proposal. I think that's pretty much the only future for Syria where there will be some stabilization of the situation and an end to the hostilities. But that's been talked about for a while. I haven't seen that advanced at all. I haven't really seen this administration it's good to hear that he supports it, but I haven't heard this administration take that up as a policy strategy, and I would like to see them seriously pursue that. But I'm not sure how they can if we're pulling out forces as it seems we are.
What about Bashar al-Assad? Like, this is the, always the question kind of circles around him, because as a person, I mean, he's really, the Iranians are really, holding on to him because he is their only person in Syria, basically. While the Russians, they say that they don't really care. I mean, they're willing to bargain when it comes to Assad, if it comes down to it, basically. He has many war crimes that are being documented against him. I mean, he's a heavy burden, if you think about it. But what is the way out for that problem? Because even the European Union or the United States are not willing to invest in Syria if Russia keeps holding on to Assad.
Well, the official U.S. policy is that Assad must go. That was the policy under the previous administration. I hope it's still the policy under this administration. I'm not entirely clear because I haven't heard them articulate that. But that is what I believe, is that Assad must go. He can't be in power anymore in order for us to stabilize Syria. And there needs to be a transition plan for him to leave, go somewhere far away and not be involved in Syrian politics anymore. And then we have to have some sort of brokered solution that involves all of the various ethnic and sectarian groups in Syria, a brokered peace process without Assad. Assad is a war criminal, and he has no right to remain in power.
Yeah, I mean, Assad the animal, as President Trump called him.
Yeah, I agree with that.
How can you keep the animal?
Yeah, the issue is, just as David had mentioned, that it's tough to have the goal of having autonomous regions, which the administration would like to have if it's possible. However, that means U.S. presence for years to come, a heavy U.S. involvement, but President Trump doesn't really want to be involved in Syria. So it's one thing to have a goal, but it's another thing to put forth a goal and then be defeated in that goal.
Exactly.
Because then you look like you lost, or you look like you're weak, and President Trump doesn't want to go down that road.
When also there's another issue in the region, and the wild card in the region, which is Israel. When it comes to the Iranian presence, Israel has been very clear that they don't want any Iranian presence in any part of Syria. I mean, we hear about some deals about the south. Israel denounced that, said they didn't make a decision yet. We don't know what's going to happen between Russia, the Assad regime, and Israel about, maybe pulling the Iranians out, putting the Russian and the Assad regime soldiers in. But what does that mean when Israel can actually and has the power to conduct airstrikes all over Syria against any Iranian presence? And that's what they've been doing. What's the prospect for Iran?
Well, I think it's important that Israel is, honestly, it's important that they're playing this role right now, because they are pushing back against Iran and the Iranian presence in Syria. I think that's important for the stability of the region and for the future of Syria. But it's a tough process for Israel to be all alone in that. And it looks like Israel has made a little bit of progress with Russia, perhaps. Even Russia is cooperating a little bit on some aspects of pressuring Iran to pull back some of its troops and its forces, and I think that's important as well. I'd like to see that move forward, but I don't expect that's going to be a game changer.
Israel's involvement. What about you, JD?
Well, I think Israel has a right to defend itself, particularly from any aggression, whether it's from the Iranians operating in Syria or whether it's Palestinians operating in Gaza with Iranian missiles, Iranian weapons. Israel has a right to defend itself. It's been invaded 3 times in its history. If it wasn't very strong, it would have been wiped off the map a long time ago. So I think that Israel should keep it up, and the U.S. is Israel's closest backer. So I think the United States should continue to support Israel. And there's really not much of a debate within the United States, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, to support Israel.
But does that mean that Israel by itself can actually take out Iran from Syria?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that Israel has a very robust ability to defend itself, and Syria is just right across the border. It's not that far. Unlike saying Israel could take out Iran's government in Tehran, it's a whole different issue because Iran's a lot further away, it's mountainous, it's a very large country. So there were a lot of people who were under this false impression that, Israel could just take out Iran's government at any time and stop their nuclear program. That's a fantasy.
Yeah.
They don't have the long-range aircraft or the refueling tankers to do that. The bunker buster bombs they would need to do that. That's a fantasy.
But
However,
they did fly some of their aircrafts over Iran just to show that they can. Recently.
But they don't have that type of capability to have aerial refueling unless the United States did it, but then the United States would be part of the war. And also they don't have the bombs, the bunker buster bombs that could penetrate Iran's nuclear facilities buried under mountains. Israel doesn't have that capability.
Yes.
So while they can attack Iranians in Syria, they don't have the ability to take down the Iranian regime by attacking Iran itself.
Yes, exactly, not Iran itself. We saw in Iraq, obviously, what happened with Sadr winning, who was anti-American, but also anti-Iran. Now we know that there's that coalition that's being formed between less of Iran's puppet, not like al-Maliki and al-Amiri. But we saw recently that the American ambassador in Baghdad actually had an iftar with al-Amiri, who is a very well-known Iranian, what do you call it, affiliated Iraqi leader who was not being voted in by the Iraqi people because they didn't want any Iranian influence, as it seems. But why is the American ambassador having iftar with him?
Well, Ambassador Suleiman, he has a difficult job in Baghdad, and he does need to reach out to each of the leaders of the parties if the U.S. is going to play a role in the government formation process in Iraq. So I'm not going to necessarily criticize him for having Amiri over for an iftar, but I agree it's pretty bad optics. And what I would like to see is for the U.S. to play a significant role in the government formation process. In the last 2 government formation processes in Iraq, it took a long time, many months. It was gridlocked, and it didn't ultimately come out all that well, although I think the last one we got Abadi, which was better than the other choices that we have. So I'm worried about what's going to come out of this process. As you mentioned, Sadr got the most votes. Amiri is still a player in this. These are very anti-American figures, and Amiri is a very pro-Iranian figure. And I worry that Iran is going to have more influence in this process than it had in the last few processes. So that's why it's so important for U.S. engagement.
You think Iran will have more chances now, even though Sadr won the vast majority?
I do. Sadr is, he's an Iraqi nationalist, but he's a Shiite leader, and he has ties to many of the other Shia leaders. He has long-standing ties to Iran, and while he's often been critical to Iran, Iranian support is important for him and for his party as well. And so I think that Iran will be a significant player in this government formation process, and that's why we need the U.S. and the West also involved in order to push back on the things that Iran is trying to get out of the Iraq process, which is they want a puppet in Baghdad.
What do you think, JD?
Yeah, I agree with David's analysis on that. It's very hard without being the ambassador in Baghdad to see what challenges he faces on a given day. So he has to try to do his best to represent the United States and to have a government that's formed in Iraq that's as favorable as it can be towards the United States. If you start sealing out major blocks of who the Iraqi people voted for, well, then you get an enemy. Or a worse enemy. So it's better to have some type of dialogue. And we have to remember Sadr was one of the major militia leaders for the Shia against the United States. And so it's fraught with peril, but the ambassador has to do what he can to make things as calm as possible.
Exactly, in Iraq. Now I want to move to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We know that there's a lot of talks that we've heard, very shallow, nothing in details about the deal of the century between the Palestinians and Israelis. Now they're talking about that they're probably going to be announcing, that the Trump administration is going to be announcing and talking about this deal recently, or soon, maybe after the meeting with Kim Jong-un. What do you expect this deal is going to have, and what are the prospects for peace in the region? I mean, that would be major.
Yes, it would be major. I think that the United States is going to support Israel. Mr. Trump's ambassador to Israel used to be his real estate attorney, so they're very close. It's not just a diplomat. I remember during the campaign reading these quotes from a guy who said he was Israel's the policy representative for Israel. I'm like, who is this person? And I checked, and it was this real estate attorney. So they're close.
Yeah.
So they're in sync for supporting Israel, whatever they do.
But the thing is that, after the Trump administration made that decision to move the embassy, doesn't that give the president some leverage on Israel to do something and be engaged with him
yes,
in a possible deal?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, there's been a law in Congress since the 1990s to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's been in the U.S. law, but no president really has dared to do it. So this is good that President Trump actually lived up to something that he was talking about during the campaign. And I could also mention that before I was with the Trump campaign, I was Governor Mike Huckabee's chief foreign policy advisor. He's a former governor from Arkansas, and he was a top-tier presidential candidate. For the Huckabee campaign, it was very important to the governor to have essentially a recognition that there's no peace anyway. So why are we trying so hard for this two-state solution? Why are we trying so hard to keep the embassy in Tel Aviv when the Palestinian leadership either has been in two camps? One camp under Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map, and the other camp in Fatah in the West Bank basically wants to accept Israel's right to exist, but with the right of return. Meaning millions of Palestinians would go to Israel,
And
meaning
that's not gonna happen
it's
to
a
the
nightmare for Israel. Israel would no longer be a Jewish state. So the Palestinian leaders are basically making the entire Palestinian population suffer. Many good and innocent Palestinians who just want to raise their families are suffering because of the Palestinian leadership and their refusal to compromise. So I'd say President Trump picked up where Governor Huckabee had left off and basically has adopted the same type of policies.
And then Jordan is going through a crisis right now, and Jordan has a majority Palestinians inside of it. We know that there is, some tension right now between the king and the Jordanians, and then the Palestinian also part of the society, according to some sources. But how would that reflect if a movement does occur on the deal between the Palestinians and Israelis? How would that affect Jordan? Do you think that would be better for Jordan to basically find some way forward for the peace process?
Well, certainly it would be better for Jordan if Palestinians who wanted to return to Palestine were able to do that, which would be the ultimate, one of the ultimate results of a real lasting peace. The things that JD mentioned that the Palestinian leaders have demanded are inappropriate, and I agree with him that the Palestinians have poor leadership. And they need better leadership, more realistic leaders. But I think that a good president who's really committed to making this work can bang some heads together, get the Palestinians and their leaders to be more realistic. Also have to get Israel to give up some things, like give up building new settlements. That's something that Israel could easily give up without, jeopardizing its ability to be a Jewish state. And if the president really were serious about solving this problem, he would spend time with both sides and coerce and push each side to give in on certain things to get closer to a peace process.
And you're not seeing this right now as we speak?
No, not at all.
Now let's go to the Kim Jong-un meeting.
Okay.
What do you think, JD, is going to happen? Because this is still a historical thing on its own, regardless of what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, I think it's very positive. Just like David was saying, to have the ability for the U.S. president to sit down with North Korea's leader is very important. I recently had a column in American Military News which talked about how Kim Jong-un is never going to get a better deal, so he better take whatever Trump offers him. And the reason he'll never get a better deal is because Trump has been the toughest American president on North Korea since the actual shooting war in the 1950s with President Truman. At the same time, he's also the president who most wants to negotiate an end to the status quo. We're $20 trillion in debt in the United States. We have about 25,000 troops in South Korea. But what do we get for that, besides defending South Korea? The United States has already made South Korea great again. We've made Japan great again. We finished 2 wars that we did not start, both in World War II and in Korea. So President Trump during the campaign talked about, well, what if South Korea, what if Japan did more to defend themselves. What if they had nuclear weapons, for instance, and the world was shocked? Why? What is he talking about? And I understood what he meant. I was brand new to the campaign when he said it, so I'm like, oh, okay. But he has a valid point. Why are we spending so much time, effort, energy, trillions of dollars around the world to defend our allies? And what do we get out of it? So President Trump wants to negotiate an end to the status quo. Kim Jong-un would be smart to take whatever deal he gets.
Do you think, I mean, he should be looking at it in that way, giving his options? I mean, nobody tried to talk to him before this president or anything recently.
It's hard to imagine what Kim Jong-un actually thinks. He's a mercurial figure. He's a war criminal himself. He runs one of the most authoritarian, closed countries in the world. What does he really want? I think the one thing we know he wants is to stay in power, right? And so if we can sketch out a deal that enables him to give up the weapons, somehow makes him think he's going to stay in power forever, but doesn't actually enable him more to stay in power, that's what we have to try and we have to thread that needle. And that's what the president has to do. It's a really tough agenda for him. So it's good that he's going to meet. It's miraculous that Secretary of State Pompeo was able to get the meeting back on track after President Trump canceled it with his letter. And I want to be optimistic, but I think we also have to be realistic that not much is going to come out of this first summit to really change things.
Yeah, so it needs more to come, more summits to come. The thing is that we're seeing right now also is that there's tension between the United States and China. I mean, we saw that Russia was nervous also about, this initiative by the United States to bring in North Korea to the Western camp or try to kind of neutralize the relationship with North Korea. That makes authoritarian countries and dictatorships are probably kind of happy having North Korea on their camp, more nervous, it seems. And then there are other reasons why there's the economical issues between the United States and China also kind of keep that tension, and now it's rising. What is going on between the United States and China? Because we also had mixed messages from the president about the policy towards China. Sometimes it's tough, sometimes it's nice and diplomatic. Where are we?
Well, the UN was able to pass very tough sanctions against North Korea. And of course, we rely on China and Russia because they have borders with North Korea, so they could help evade sanctions. Now, China and Russia reluctantly agreed to sign on to those sanctions, which was helpful. China had pressured North Korea about refusing to import some of their coal shipments and things of that nature, cracking down on border smuggling. So China had been helpful. But at the end of the day, China wants Kim Jong-un to stay as well, or at least his regime to stay, because they don't want a friendly U.S. government, U.S. allied government right on their border. Again, they don't want that. So they want Kim Jong-un in there, but they want to have him behave. But he doesn't really necessarily listen to them either. So it's a frustrating thing for China too.
Is that why there's tension right now between the United States and China? Is that the only reason, or there's other reasons? I mean, what's going on?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for there to be tension between the U.S. and China. One of the things is that China is not really clear on what President Trump's policy is. It goes back and forth. Sometimes he praises China, sometimes he criticizes China. He's starting a trade war with China. Those things all concern China. But with respect to North Korea, I think China feels like it's in a position of power because it's the one country that really has influence over North Korea. It uses that influence to get certain things that it wants. It also uses North Korea as sort of a chess piece in its different diplomatic battles with the United States, and it doesn't want to lose that. So I think all of those are things that concern China about what's happening. But I think if we're able to keep China involved, feel like it's playing a role in moving the peace process forward, and shame them if they do anything to interfere with the peace process with Kim Jong-un, that's the right approach.
Lastly, I want to ask you about Russia. Russia is also, we have a very complicated relationship, let's say, especially now that there's still ongoing investigations with the meddling by Russia in the recent elections. However, the relationships are not the best at the same time. The Trump administration imposed sanctions on Russia that were not, imposed during the Obama administration time. We saw they kicked out 68 diplomats from the Russian consulate in San Francisco. So there's a lot of action that was done by this administration also against Russia. So what is going on between the United States and Russia? I mean, there is a realistic administration here that acknowledges Russia's role, but it's also like a love-hate relationship there.
Yeah, very much so. During the campaign, of course, President Trump made it very clear he wanted to have better relations with Russia. I was the director of national security, as I mentioned, and I gave a speech at the Republican National Convention to over 50 ambassadors from all around the world. And I shook the Russian ambassador's hand in a group of many other ambassadors. Yet the way people in Congress, some Democrats, and people in the media portrayed it is, oh, J.D. Gordon met with the Russian ambassador. And since that night, I ate chicken satays with him at a networking reception. Oh, that's 2 secret meetings. It was ridiculous what's going on in America right now about this witch hunt. It's terrible. So that's really jeopardized relations with the United States. President Trump wants to have better relations with Russia, just like President Obama did, just like President Bush did. They all tried. But because of this onslaught of this, I would call it a deep state mentality, almost like Turkey, but not as bad as Turkey in the United States. There are people that were leading our intelligence and law enforcement agencies who have been after Trump and associates like me to try to destroy us. It's very un-American, but it's happening.
What do you think, David?
The U.S. policy on Russia right now under this administration is weak and anemic. It makes no sense. Democrats and Republicans in Congress don't support the president's approach to Russia. The things that the Trump administration, all due respect, did with respect to Russia are offensive to our notions of rule of law, of transparency. You may have met with the ambassador, maybe you were honest about it, but many of your colleagues in the Trump campaign were not honest about it, lied about it, this investigation that the special counsel is moving forward has resulted in indictments already, including the campaign chairman, when you were on the campaign during the convention, has been indicted for crimes that include his relationship with Russians. It's astounding that it has happened. What we should all do, Democrats and Republicans, is support the rule of law, support the special counsel, which was appointed by a Trump appointee, and let it move forward with its investigation, because it's very important for the U.S. to understand the role that Russia played in its influence and contacts with the Trump campaign, in interfering with our election, which our U.S. intelligence community are in unanimous agreement that it did that. And President Trump cannot come to terms that that happened. And that's very troubling. It's troubling for the national security of our country. And until this administration comes to terms with it, it's going to continue to be dragged down by this situation. What this president should do is try to be the adult in the room and say that he supports the rule of law. He'll let the investigation go forward. He won't pardon anyone where there is evidence of them having engaged in improper ways with Russia. That's so important for not just to understand what happened, but to prevent Russia from doing this in the future, because it wants to do it again. It wants to interfere in our democratic process. It resents our support for democracy here in the United States and around the world.
I mean, what do you think, JD? Because, I mean, the investigations, they are, going. I don't think the president tried to stop it or do anything.
He's done everything he can to stop it. He's threatened numerous times to fire Rosenstein, to fire Mueller. He's threatened to pardon people. He's suggested he can pardon himself, which doesn't even make sense if you read the Constitution, if you understand what our founding fathers...
He doesn't need to pardon himself because he hasn't done anything. He said he has the right, but he's not going to do it. That's my understanding from his statement yesterday, right? Is that what you're talking about?
He said he has the right to pardon himself.
But he's not going to do it.
He raised it on his own, which suggests he's thinking about pardoning himself. There's no one else, not one legal scholar anywhere in this country, not one serious legal scholar agrees with him on that other than Rudy Giuliani.
What do you think, JD? I mean...
Well, I agree with some of the things David said and disagree with some others. I agree with him that there have been some people affiliated with the Trump campaign that were not honest at all about meetings with Russians, no matter how innocuous and harmless.
Yes.
The spokeswoman for President Trump was Hope Hicks in her 20s with very little public relations experience, and she was the one who said, oh, there were no contacts with Russians. So even then, me shaking the Russian ambassador's hand, and my boss, Senator Sessions, who's now the Attorney General, since he shook the Russian ambassador's hand too, we were treated like criminals.
Because she said that
Because
there
she
was,
said that,
so
right.
she made it worse by saying that there's no contact whatsoever.
Right, and then Trump backed her up. So that made me and the Attorney General now look like criminals. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Now, David's right. There have been some indictments. 4 people are probably going to go to prison from the Trump campaign. But it has nothing to do with the alleged crime, which was collusion. They're for other things. Financial crimes, money laundering, lying to the FBI. These aren't for collusion. About 50 Trump associates, 50, have been through these congressional hearings and the special counsel. We're spending millions of dollars of our own money to defend ourselves from a witch hunt. There are a few guilty people, but not for collusion.
So basically, it's meddling, where Russia is was trying to influence the process, our democratic process here, but it was not from the according to the administration. From the administration side, there was no attempt to actually contact them or collaborate with them.
Well, it wasn't from the campaign. Russians were meddling. That's
yes,
true.
That's true.
Yes.
But nothing from the campaign side. No collaboration ever occurred between the campaign and the Russians. That's
No
what you're
collusion.
saying.
Now,
No
there
collusion.
were meetings that people shouldn't have taken, like the
Yes.
president's son, Don Jr., took a very ill-advised meeting in June of 2016 with some Russians at Trump Tower.
Yeah.
Now, I was the director of national security. Do you think I knew about the meeting? The
Yeah.
answer is no. I didn't.
Yeah.
I would have told them, don't do that. But
Yeah.
they didn't ask me. So there
And
were a
they're
lot
not
of mistakes made.
they're not from a political background.
Right, so they say whatever they want.
We're going to be waiting to see on this because I think this is still unfolding. And we are out of time. I mean, I wanted to talk more about this because it's very interesting. But thank you so much both for joining me today. And I hope to see you again soon in the future.
Shukran.
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 That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching The Access. Good night.